All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I'm Jason Gumper from msdynamicsworld.com. I am joined today by Lucas Alexander. He's a Dynamics CRM technical architect at Tribridge. He's also an active blogger on Dynamics CRM and related technology. I've been reading his blog for some time, and Lucas has really done a nice job of presenting some interesting projects, some that have really got my attention, and I was glad we were able to find the time to have him join us today and share some of those things he's been working on and learning about. We're really taking Dynamics CRM and adding Microsoft platform technology in interesting ways. So glad to have Lucas here today. As we get started, please know that you can add your feedback and ask questions using the Q&A block or the chat that you should see to the right of the main webcast presentation area. Lucas will be making time for questions during and after this session. So without further delay, please allow me to welcome Lucas Alexander.
Hey, thank you, Jason. I appreciate that nice introduction. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. It's still morning for me, but I know afternoon for a lot of other folks. My name is Lucas Alexander, and today I'm going to be talking about sentiment analysis in Dynamics CRM using Azure Text Analytics. Jason mentioned a little bit about me. Let me tell you a few more things, maybe a little bit of why I pursued this and why it might be useful to you. So I am a Dynamics CRM technical architect at Tribridge. I've been working with Dynamics CRM since version 3, starting back in 2005. I live in Auburn, Alabama, which, depending on how football season happens to go, is really nice, or you get a hard time from a lot of people. I blog regularly on Dynamics CRM at my blog, alexanderdevelopment.net. I'm also pretty active with the blogging, tweeting on Twitter, and then I have a GitHub repository where I have lots of sample code for things I've done with CRM. So I highly encourage you to check that out. My particular areas of interest with Dynamics CRM are data integrations, getting the CRM platform to talk to other things, and extending the platform with custom code. So let's go ahead and talk about our agenda for today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is sentiment analysis in Dynamics CRM using Azure Text Analytics. So first we're going to talk a little bit about what is Azure Machine Learning. Then we're going to talk about the Azure Machine Learning Text Analytics API specifically. We'll go on to talk about the interoperability methods that you would use when you communicate with Azure. Discuss very briefly some potential CRM applications for sentiment analysis. Then we'll pivot to talk about the solution approach I've used to set this up. We'll do a code deep dive and a demonstration, and then we will round it out with some subjects for further reading and opportunities for questions. As Jason mentioned, I will be taking questions during the presentation, so if you have any questions, please feel free, put them in the Q&A or chat windows, and I will respond to them. I'll also be doing periodic checkpoints throughout just to make sure that nobody has any questions. So first, let's talk about what is Azure Machine Learning. And in any kind of overview I give of machine learning, I feel compelled to put this picture of Samuel L. Jackson from Pulp Fiction, say big data one more time. And I think that's funny, but I think it's telling too, because in our industry there are certain buzzwords that get kicked around a lot, right? People talk about cloud a lot, people talk about big data. And I know as a practitioner, you go into this and you say, I know I should be doing something with big data. Everybody else is doing something with big data. How do I get into it? And I think it's very hard for a lot of people to understand exactly what big data can do for them. And so I like Azure Machine Learning because I think it makes big data and machine learning easily accessible and usable. So what is Azure Machine Learning? And I'm not going to read this slide to you, but basically Azure Machine Learning is Microsoft's cloud-based machine learning platform. So you can plug into it, you can create your data models, machine learning models, you've got access to predictive analytics. You can do a lot of interesting things very easily. Because it's through Azure, it's all on demand, you pay for what you use, you're able to actually do a lot of it for free. So it's a very powerful platform. And if you haven't looked at it, I highly recommend that you take a look at it. What we're going to be talking about today really just scratches the surface of the things you can do with Azure Machine Learning. So we talk about the Azure Machine Learning Text Analytics API. That's a mouthful. But basically, the Text Analytics API, it's not a separate offering from the Azure Machine Learning. But what it does is instead of you having to go out and build the models yourself and train the models and say, okay, I think I want to do this, let's run some experiments and build a web service based off that. The Text Analytics API, it's an add-on. You can get it through the Azure Marketplace, and it just works out of the box. So it's a service that you can go, and it does a couple of different things. You can do sentiment analysis, so you can go and give it some text. I love my dishwasher. Earlier this week, or last week, my dishwasher broke, and so I've been sending lots of social media tweets and whatnot about my experiences with my dishwasher, and probably if someone were to apply sentiment analysis to those, it would be highly negative. So you can go to the Text Analytics API, you can take some of the things I tweeted, for example, and it would give you a score. Something else the Text Analytics API does that we're not going to be digging into today is key phrase extraction. So you can take a bunch of unstructured text in an email or case notes or something, and it will pull out what the relevant key phrases are. So you could use that if you wanted to help find similar things. So you could run key phrase extraction against different emails, and you can see what are the topics that are trending, what are the topics that these different emails or case notes or whatever have in common. So both of those are available through the Text Analytics API without you having to build or train or maintain any sort of models. I also like the Text Analytics API because if you just want to dip your toes in the water, it's free. It's free up to 10,000 requests a month. So it's very cost effective for someone who wants to just get in and tinker with it. I will note that right now, English is the only language that's supported for sentiment analysis and key phrase extraction. If you want to do those kinds of activities using Azure Machine Learning with a different language, you would then have to build and train your own custom models. So if you want to get started with Azure Machine Learning Text Analytics, you have to sign up for it. So you go to this URL here, datamarket.azure.com, dataset, AMLA, text analytics. You can click the sign up button, and you can sign up for the free tier, or you can sign up for a pay tier if you want. And then you just walk through the prompts. It's pretty simple. If you haven't worked with Azure before, it's very easy to sign up for these sorts of things. The main thing is, as you are signing up for the Text Analytics API, is you will be presented with an access key. So when you're signing up for the service, you'll make the request against a particular endpoint, and it's secured using your access key. It's basically a token. So you would need to make sure that you get a copy of your access key so you can use it for any sort of programmatic integration. A little bit later, when we take a look at the code, I will show how we use the access keys to communicate with Azure. I've got a screenshot here where you're getting the access key, and then you can copy it. Notice I've covered up most of it. If for whatever reason your key is compromised or you want to generate a new one, you can also regenerate a new one, which will then expire your old one, and then the new one will be valid. And then anytime you want to go manage your text analytics access going forward, you just do that through the Azure management portal. So I'm just going to pause real quick. Are there any questions about Azure text analytics in general? Okay. So I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll go ahead and move on. Let's talk about interoperability methods for a minute. So, when we talk about web services, there are really two different kinds of web services that we might talk about, and I hate to say there's just two, but you can kind of split it up into either SOAP web services and then there's REST web services. The Azure Machine Learning makes use of REST web services. REST, if you're not familiar with it, it's representational state transfer. It's a lightweight alternative to SOAP, and though I would say it's one of the things that's a little bit hard to define, but you can think about it as web services based on URLs. And I'm sure that a lot of people would take issue with me trying to summarize it that simply, but that's not a bad way of looking at it. It's basically people said, hey, we've got this World Wide Web thing. What if we made web services that just work like going through the web and going to URLs? One of the nice things about REST is that it's not really tied to any specific data format for exchanging data. So you can have REST that uses XML, you can use JSON. The Azure Machine Learning uses JSON, which we'll go ahead and talk about here on the next slide. So I don't know how familiar all of you are with JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is much, much, much more human readable than XML, at least usually. It's a very lightweight interchange format. So we see here on the slide, I've got an example of some JSON. This is actually what a request would look like to one of the Azure Text Analytics endpoints. So in this case, I have an array of inputs that I'm going to send to the sentiment analysis batch service. So where I have ID, that's just an identifier that's used. So if you're sending a batch of things, Azure is going to send back a batch of responses. So the IDs help you tie those back. And then the text is, in the first one, hello world, hello foo world, hello my world. So we have an array of 3 JavaScript objects, each with an ID and a text number. So this is pretty easy. It's something that I think really I see a lot more JSON used for REST web services than I do XML. This is easily parsable in a browser. This is easily parsable in .NET. So JSON is definitely something, if you're not familiar with it and you want to be looking at interoperability between different platforms in a cloud world, then JSON is definitely something that you should take a look at. So now that we've talked a little bit about Azure Machine Learning and how it works and how it communicates, let's think about why do we care from a CRM perspective. So obviously in CRM 2016, Microsoft is saying there's going to be integration with Azure Machine Learning. There's a social engagement tool. There's different things you might look at from a case management perspective. But just in general, think about things that we can do with sentiment analysis. I can route emails to queues based on sentiment. So I'll go back to the example of my broken dishwasher. I might send an email to the manufacturer explaining how disappointed I am that it's not working, or I might have an issue with the service tech who came out, or any number of things. They would probably want to handle that email differently than if I were sending an email about how great the dishwasher were, how nice it is, how quiet it is, how wonderful it is. So from a CRM perspective, I can scan inbound emails when they come into the system. I can estimate the sentiment as positive or negative, or neutral even, and then I can route that to a queue using the sentiment, as opposed to sending it to a general queue and then having somebody triage it from there. I can dynamically load agent scripts. So when I think about maybe from a unified service desk perspective, based on notes or the interactions the agent's having with the caller in real time, I could use that as an input to load my scripting. So maybe I've got a happy caller script and I've got an angry caller script. And then also I can use this for reporting on interactions. So if my agents are taking good case notes, then I can go through and I can look and say, we had so many positive interactions, we had so many negative interactions, and I can use that to quantify as well. I don't know. I'm sure that there are a ton of different applications I haven't considered. You may have seen some in your own day-to-day experiences, and I don't want to say the sky's the limit, but there's a ton of stuff you can do with this. And so that's one reason that I went ahead and built this out as a custom integration, because the goal was I wanted to be able to touch any CRM data and apply sentiment analysis to it. So the approach to the solution is actually pretty simple. In this case, what I'm using is a custom workflow activity that can be called from a dynamic CRM process. So I figure I can call it from an action, I can call it from a dialogue, I can call it from a workflow. And I think that really covers most of my basis for how I want to use it in CRM. Because if I can call it through a process, then I can expose it from the client side. So I can have a form that calls the process, that calls the custom workflow activity. If I can call it from a dialogue, I can do some sort of interactive process with the dynamic CRM user. Or from workflow, then I can run it either in an asynchronous or synchronous manner. So the process is going to take text from CRM. In the example I'll be showing today, it's a dialogue where the CRM user enters some text, but this could just as easily be a workflow that reads the body of an email. So it passes that to a custom workflow activity. The custom workflow activity goes ahead, it formats the text as a JSON object, and then it passes it over to the text analytics API. The text analytics API processes the text and then generates a sentiment score. The text analytics API generates a sentiment score from 0 to 1. Numbers being closer to 0 are more to the negative end of the spectrum. Numbers closer to 1 are more to the positive end of the spectrum. Once it generates that, it returns a response to the custom workflow activity. The custom workflow activity is then going to parse that response because it's going to come back in a JSON format. It's going to extract the sentiment score, return the score to the calling process, and then the process is going to do whatever you want with it. So in the case of the demonstration I have today, the dialogue will take some text, and then it will display the sentiment score as a number. It's not very exciting, but it does exercise the process. Any questions about that solution approach so far? Okay. So moving on, the custom workflow activity itself really has 4 functions, right? And we talked a little bit about them just a minute ago. One thing that I did not mention on that previous slide is we want to make sure we take out any HTML tags. So if it's an email or case notes, or somehow or other HTML's gotten in there, that's going to confuse the text analytics API. So the custom workflow activity I'm going to show has a helper function that strips out any HTML tags. Then we generate the JSON, sentiment analysis request, post it to Azure. We're just using a standard HTTP web request from .NET. Then we get the response. We deserialize that JSON to a .NET object, and then we take the sentiment score from that object and we return it to the calling process. So here is what the request and response look like that we're going to have to deal with. So as I mentioned, this request is a batch of text records or strings that we want to analyze for sentiment. And then here at the bottom, the response is the sentiment analysis for that batch. So you see up on the top, text is hello world, ID 1. On the bottom, ID 1 has a score of 0.95 for, and so on. So that's deemed to be positive. The next one, hello foo world. For whatever reason, foo makes it a little bit more negative. We're still on the positive side of things, but it's 0.78. And then finally, the hello my world with ID of 3 has a score of if you round it, it's 0.9. So one question you may be asking yourself is, why are we using the batch mechanism here? The Text Analytics API does have a way that you can supply a single string to analyze. You actually embed that in the call, like to the URL itself, so you don't even have to post JSON. I don't like that because, it's not that I don't like it, I don't think that's a wise approach to use here because we might have, we have text of unknown length. So, certain length restrictions on the length of a URL, we could very well exceed it with a lengthy email, lengthy case notes. So in this case, what we'll be doing, we're making a call to the sentiment batch endpoint. However, we'll just be sending a batch of 1. So we won't, if you look at this request, we won't have the ID 2 and 3. It'll just be ID 1, and then we'll just get a single result back. So any questions about the request and the response, format or the batch or anything like that? Okay. So, so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over to Visual Studio, and we will kind of walk through how the code works and what it does. Okay. So here in Visual Studio, and this is available through my GitHub repository. There will be links at the end of the presentation, so you can go out and you can download this file if you want to take a closer look at it yourself. But we'll just walk through it. So what we have here, this is a custom workflow activity class. We take a couple of inputs. So first we have the text input because we need text to analyze. We have the API key. You could, of course, if you want, you could hard code your API key in this. I don't recommend it because if you have to regenerate your key, then you have to recompile your assemblies and redeploy them. So I supply the API key in the process definition. I supply it to the custom activity. So those are my 2 input arguments. And then my output is just the sentiment analysis score. So the score is going to be a decimal. We'll return that back. Here I have the endpoint. I do hard code that. I expect that not to change, and I did not want to be in a position of entering it in when I'm designing the process, and then oops, I made a mistake. So this should be the same. You can see here we have the basic endpoint, right? This goes to the text analytics service, version 1, and then get sentiment batch. If you do sign up for the text analytics API, there's a ton of documentation out there that talks about the different endpoints and the different messages and how you communicate with it. I have here my activity name. This is just used for my own internal tracing and error logging. Once we get down into the execute block of the activity, it's all kind of standard stuff for a while, right? We set it up. We, do we have our contacts? Let's log what we're doing, so on and so forth. Then we finally get down to where things start to get interesting. So as I mentioned, the first thing we need to do is we need to remove any HTML tags from the input text. So first we read the input text from the execution context. Assuming that we've been supplied text, we can work with it. If we don't, we're going to do something. We're not even going to waste our time. We move on to strip out any HTML from the text we want to analyze. So over here I have just a strip HTML function. I actually pulled it off of Code Projects a number of years ago. It's worked for me pretty well over time, but just some regular expressions, strips out pretty much anything between angle brackets. So going back into the workflow assembly code or workflow activity code. So we get our text. We also go ahead and escape any double quote errors. If you think about what the JSON looked like, everything had double quotes around it. So we need to escape those so that the JSON doesn't get confused. And then we set up our web request object. So down here on this line, we're setting up a call to the web address that we had earlier. And then we start to actually build the payload that we're going to post to the service. So we have to give it a content type. Notice it's the form URL encoded. And then the method is going to be post as opposed to a get because we're posting the data. And then so we start to assemble the request itself. Now this line is where we build the JSON that we're going to send. So as you can see in here, I've got each of the double quotes inside are escaped with a backslash. And I just concatenate the general array of inputs, ID1, text, with the text that I've prepared already. Now I can get away with doing this because I'm only sending a batch size of 1. If I were trying to do something more complicated, send a batch of lots of things, I would not do it this way. I would probably set up actual .NET classes and objects and then serialize them. But for this, it's a very lightweight and easy way to do it. Finally, I come down here, and this is where I specify my API key for the authorization. So what Azure Machine Learning is looking for is a header that contains the API key. So we go ahead and we construct it. It's account key : then whatever your API key is that you copied back at the beginning, you convert it to a base 64 string, and then you supply it in the authorization headers. Without this, Azure is going to return an error. So this is important. We'll kind of skip over this. We create a stream, we post the stream, we get the response. Once we get the response, that's when it's time the response will then be in a JSON format, so now we need to parse that. There's a couple different ways to parse JSON in .NET. The way that I would generally recommend for almost every other application except for a CRM custom workflow activity is to use a library called JSON.NET. It makes it super simple to work with JSON, either to create JSON or read JSON. I love it. I think everybody loves it. It's actually, if you use a NuGet package manager, it's like the first thing that comes up just by default, right? So it's a great tool. I'm not using it here because I did not want to have to include the assembly using IL merge. So I don't know, for those of you who are on the call, how familiar you are with this. When you go to deploy a plugin or a custom workflow activity in CRM, you can deploy a DLL, a single DLL. So if I wanted to use JSON.NET, I would have had to merge it in using the IL merge tool. That's not super complicated. It does obviously increase the size of the DLL I'm going to deploy. And for what I'm doing here, my application it's simple enough. I don't really need JSON.NET. If I were much more complicated than this, I probably would use the JSON.NET approach instead. So what I can do instead is I can use the .NET data contract JSON deserializer class that works by, I set up C# classes that kind of look like what the JSON objects are going to be, and then I tell .NET, I say, here's some JSON text, and deserialize it to these objects. So let me go ahead and skip down here real quick and show you what those look like. So to communicate, to handle a response, I need three classes. So first, I have a class that represents just the response in general. So if you think back to what I was showing on the response consists of an array of sentiment batch result items. So remember there was ID 1, 0.95, ID 2, 0.77, ID 3, 0.90, stuff like that. There's those results, and then there's also an array of errors. Now, in the example I showed you, there were no errors. It was an empty array. We were very happy that nothing bad happened. However, it is possible that you would get an error. So when we handle the response, we have to account for both the results and the errors. So in this case, I have this class called sentiment batch result. Marks as data contract, and then it's got these data members. So a list of sentiment batch result items, which are another custom class I have, and a list of error record items, which is another class I have. And if we look at each one of those, we can come back up here to sentiment batch result item, score and ID. So this is exactly what we looked at, that ID1 score 0.95. And then the error records, very similar, again, ID, but now instead of a score, we have a message. So whatever the error was that was encountered, we'll have that. So using these three classes, I can deserialize the response back from Azure. So any questions about that? Okay.
Hey, Lucas, there is one question that came in a little while ago as you were starting the code, look at the code there. What counts as a transaction for charging? Is one batch of 3 counted as one transaction or 3 transactions?
And that's a great question, and I will say I do not know the answer to that, unfortunately. I would encourage you to go out and just look at the Azure documentation. I believe there is in the documentation talks about what constitutes a transaction, but I just don't know off the top of my head. Anything else on that point?
I'm not seeing any other questions at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so moving back to it, so that's how we deserialize the response. Then after this, we just check, do we have errors? If our error count is 0, we're going to output the score. If our error count is not 0, we're going to throw an invalid plugin execution exception to say, hey, I got an error. And that's it. I mean, this is really super simple. I will say this general pattern of working with the JSON REST web request, I've used this for a number of integrations before, both sort of hobby projects and things that are in production. So even if you're not interested in doing sentiment analysis, this works for a lot of different things. And then also this general approach works for working with Azure Machine Learning in general. So if you decide you want to build your own custom model, and I've actually blogged about this some as well, I have an integration where it's sort of a predictive analytics running against the AdventureWorks data set to say, do we think this contact in CRM would buy a bike? So I post data using JSON, using this exact same method, and then retrieve it the same way. So this is certainly not useful in all situations, but there are a lot that it is. So let me stop sharing Visual Studio and come back to the presentation here for a minute, and we will walk through how we build the CRM process. So as I mentioned, I have a CRM dialog that I'm running. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to prompt the agent or the user for some text. I'm going to pass the text off to the workflow activity, and then I'm going to return the score back. So here's the high-level overview. We dig in. I've got a prompt. I'm not terribly creative, so the prompt is just input some text. Then what we do is we call the workflow activity. So here are my parameters. So notice the text input is the text that I prompted the user to supply. The API key, again, this is the API key that you get when you sign up for the Text Analytics API, or you've regenerated it. Just paste that in there. And then the response here is just go out and write out the score, and then the score value that's returned from the workflow activity. So let me show a quick demo of this in CRM. Okay. So in this case, this is a CRM 2015 instance I have running on a local virtual machine. I have created a dialog that runs on accounts. It's not really necessary. I could have run it on anything. I just chose count. So when I go out and, let's say, run or start dialog, so I have my analyze sentiment demo dialog. And when I go and I run it, I can input some text. I'm going to keep going back to the dishwasher until it gets fixed. So I hate my dishwasher. So I hit next. So behind the scenes, it called out to Azure. Took a second, got a response. We see that is 0.02. That's not the most negative thing, but it's pretty negative. So again, you can sort of visualize how this could be used in a real process. I mean, I don't think that you want the agents manually typing things in and getting a sentiment score. This is just an easy way to visualize it. Because I try to be a positive guy, I'll try to end on a more positive note. So I really enjoyed doing this. We'll see what Azure makes of that. Okay, so that's 0.71, so I brought us back into more positive territory. So any questions about how this works from an end-to-end perspective? Okay, so
I do see one question that came in.
okay.
Are you seeing that, Lucas? Oh no, you're on
I
your
am
desktop.
not.
So I can read it.
Oh, I see it.
Okay, let me read that to you here. You got it?
Okay. No, I'm sorry. I thought I had it. I just see the question about the transaction.
So it says, here in the UK, we eat our fish and chips from newspaper. This removes the need for dishwashers. What does this mean? It's text analytics, not for us. Well,
That's good. That's good. Well, I think you guys can still use it. I mean, there are probably other things you could complain about. You could complain about soggy fish and chips, I suppose. At the risk of sounding environmentally unfriendly, until my dishwasher is fixed, my family has been using a few more paper plates and disposable things ourselves. But anyway, anything else? Okay.
What about large amounts of content like parsed out documents?
So I don't know actually if Text Analytics API enforces some sort of limit on the size of the payload itself beyond that. In general, that's kind of what I was trying to target by using the batch mechanism instead of just posting it in the URL. When I think about if I'm going to extract text, if I'm going to extract text from a large document, even if it's a really large document, as long as it's just text, that's not going to be huge in absolute terms. I mean, I suppose it could be if you're trying to, like a novel or something, but a letter or forms or something like that, I think you would be okay to use this approach.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions right now.
So I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Did another one come in?
Another one did come in. What would be your thoughts on using text sentiment as one input into a wider model which can be used to rate overall satisfaction of a customer?
I think that's a fantastic idea, right? I think if you go down this road, if you start to model the overall interaction with the customer, there's a lot of information you could put in, and you could pass this back into a custom model using Azure Machine Learning. So you could take the sentiment of case notes or email or chat transcript or whatever kind of raw text you have. I think you could feed in some additional information around maybe like handle time, some additional information. Maybe you're offering a survey, like an end-of-call survey or an end-of-chat survey. So you could take all that, and then I think you could, once you generate enough data, right? Because that's part of the problem, I think, is you start to go down this road of big data, to come back to the Pulp Fiction picture. You obviously have to have a corpus of data that's large enough that you can run some analysis on. But I think once you have some information like that, you can start to throw that against Azure Machine Learning in general and try to model that and understand how different things are impacting the customer experience. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you took this, let's say you put it on emails, for example, right? You just create an attribute on the email record itself that when the email comes in, it automatically stores the sentiment analysis. And you can do that pretty much anywhere you want in the system, and you have that available. Did I answer that question? Because I think that's a really good one. Not that the fish and chips one wasn't good either.
There are a few other questions here. Yeah, and that person did say, yes, that answers your question. Could you take emails and link them to different smiley faces depending on the score?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything you would want to do, because once you get the score and you write it to the record, then you can really do anything with it that you might do in CRM normally based on some sort of attribute. Okay, I see another one. How would you connect this to a company Twitter feed? There's a couple different ways you could do that. I mean, I think if you were to look at the social engagement tool itself, that might be the better way to do this, since it's kind of built to do that out of the box. If you wanted to do a more homegrown application, what you would probably need to do is have some sort of like a listener process, and you could set this up either in an on-prem environment or in Azure. You probably wouldn't do that in CRM, but something that is connecting to Twitter. Let's assume that you're going to log the tweets in CRM. So you just have to have a mechanism to get the tweets from Twitter to CRM. And then at that point, you could have a workflow or a plugin or something that just automatically takes the text of the tweet, posts it to the text analytics API, and then gets it back. Anything else? Anybody? Okay, so sort of back to the presentation. What we have here, this was my, just here on the slides, just the negative and positive text. So promise there is some further reading if you're interested. I highly encourage you to take a look at the original blog post that this presentation is based off of. You can go out to my blog and just search for Azure or Text Analytics, or you can go to this URL directly. The code is, as I mentioned, it's on GitHub in my repository as well. I know there was a question at the beginning of the presentation, would the slides be made available? I will be posting these to SlideShare probably later today. And I don't know, Jason, if there's a way, I don't know if you would update the information on your side to point to those. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, we can do that. We can handle it. Yeah, okay, we'll put a link in the email alert we send everyone when the recording is available, and we'll also maybe embed the SlideShare as well on our site.
Okay, great. Well, I thank everybody for coming today. I don't know, are there any more questions before I turn it over to Jason?
I'm not seeing any others.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah.
And if anybody has, I was going to say real quick, I mean, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me through my blog or Twitter. My wife says I'm very boring, but I love talking about this stuff. So I would certainly be interested to hear how anybody uses this or any thoughts you might have. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Lucas. And yeah, if you do have any other questions or anything, please do feel free to just contact Lucas. We also have a quick survey that will pop up when we leave here. We really appreciate that feedback. I know our speakers do as well. So please look for that. We will be sharing a recording as well. With that, let's start to wrap up. Well, first of all, Lucas, thank you so much for taking the time today to present to our audience here. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
And thanks to everyone in the audience. Thanks to everyone in the audience for your attention as well. Yeah, with that, we are going to wrap up today. We hope to see you again soon online. Have a great day, everyone.